We live in an age of constant, tailored sensory stimulation. Social media, clickbait, advertising, you name it. Screens are everywhere. We see videos, texts, emails. We can't get away from it. Now, it's true that sensory stimulation has been part of the human condition, indeed the condition of sentience, forever, so that's nothing new. But what is new is the fact that all of this is now tailored to grab and keep our attention. Over time, this stimulation serves to agitate, fragment, and exhaust the mind. Now, ancient though it is, early Buddhism has a technique, or various techniques, for dealing with this kind of situation. We'll deal with one today, which is known as guarding the sense doors. I'll be describing what that practice is like, how it works, as well as how it can inform our practice today. So to begin with, what is it to guard the sense doors? Well, here's the situation that we are in nowadays. In fact, it's the situation we've always been in, which is that we tend to divert ourselves with pleasant and unpleasant information, data, sensations that come in through all of our senses. Our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and even our mind in the sense of good thoughts. As the Buddha describes this, he says, "When they see a sight with their eyes, if it's pleasant, they desire it, but if it's unpleasant, they dislike it. They live with mindfulness of the body unestablished, and their heart restricted, that is, restricted to what they like. Being so full of favoring and opposing, when they experience any kind of feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, they approve, welcome, and keep clinging to it." This situation, the Buddha goes on to say, gives rise to enjoyment or delight, which is to say we take delight in those things that give us pleasure. And we also, it has to be said, take delight in our hatreds. We revel in things that we hate. We talk about them a lot. We talk to our friends about how much we hate so-and-so. However, under conditions of change and uncertainty, all of this enjoyment tends to lead to confusion, to argument, to discussion, debate, dispute, and eventually to suffering, to all of this mass of suffering, as the Buddha says. We obsess about these things, and the term is mentally proliferate around our concerns, our loves, our enjoyments, our hatreds. All of these things agitate and confuse the mind. And so the Buddha recommends a practice of, as he says, guarding the sense doors, which is to guard each of the senses, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. As he says, "And how does someone guard the sense doors? When a monastic sees a sight with the eyes, or hears something with the ears, and so on, they don't get caught up in the features and details. If each of the sense faculties were left unrestrained, bad, unskillful qualities of desire and aversion would become overwhelming. For this reason, they practice restraint, protecting each of the sense faculties and achieving its restraint. They don't get caught up in the features and details. That's how someone guards the sense doors." So the training here, as we see, is not to get caught up in the features and details of what we are experiencing. Now, there are clearly many ways we can go about this. First of all, we can simply avoid things that we find disturbing. Also, we can become more mindfully aware of the causal chain that proceeds from unrestrained attention, how delight and attachment arise from this kind of sense contact. When we notice this syndrome, we practice stepping back a little bit. Now, this practice plays a key role in an early map of the path known as the gradual training. In this training, we begin with restraining ourselves ethically. So it begins with ethical restraint, not with sense restraint. So we begin by restraining ourselves from doing unethical things, such as killing or stealing or sexual misconduct or lying and so on. Typically then, in the gradual training, this practice of restraint would then continue with monastically related restraints. That is, the person would join the monastery and begin restraining themselves monastically, avoiding things like sex, music, shows, dancing, entertainment, money, and so on. Now, this kind of restraint, of course, is not going to be so important to those of us who remain within a lay lifestyle. However, we should at least keep in mind the general purpose of this kind of restraint, which is to live a more minimalist life. And then, with the ethical restraint and monastic restraint underway, the practitioner undertakes sense restraint. And that is to say, when the person notices that they are tending to relish or get involved in something because it seems pleasant, or because it seems unpleasant or repellent, then they practice stepping back a little bit, not focusing on the features and details of things that we find especially alluring, or the features and details of things that we find hateful. Because, as we all know, our mind tends to obsess around these two kinds of things. This kind of restraint, the Buddha says, eventually leads to true mindfulness, to happiness, to clarity of comprehension. It leads to our ability to concentrate and to become calm and peaceful. Our mind is no longer being pulled this way and that by information coming through each of our senses. Now, as I say, this practice was generally recommended to monastics. However, in some places in the suttas, it was also recommended to lay people. In particular, in one early sutta, the monk Bharadvaja is talking with King Udana. And King Udana is asking about practices he can use to give up his tendency towards sexual desire for certain women in his household. And the monk Bharadvaja recommends a number of different practices. However, King Udana finds problems with them, and he ends up, or I should say, Bharadvaja ends up recommending the practice of sense restraint. And at this point, King Udana says that he agrees that this, in fact, sense restraint is the only practice that really works for him in this situation. In modern life, where the things that we're confronted with through our senses are specifically tailored to grab them and not let them go, these kinds of practices can be particularly relevant. Today's features and details include things like seeing idealized lifestyles online, idealized people, or rage-inducing headlines, triggering headlines for us. And these stimuli introduce into us reactions that become very hard to stop, of desire, of hatred, and of restlessness. One key example of this that all of us will probably be familiar with is doomscrolling, getting caught in a loop of endless scrolling through disturbing or triggering online posts. One neurological description of this process involves what's known as the dopamine loop. Dopamine is key to our seeking and searching behavior. It conditions our wanting of external stimuli and is rewarded by the appearance of new information. So the modern phenomena of clickbait and doom scrolling are all conditioned on basically triggering this kind of dopamine loop. As the psychologist Susan Weinschenk put it recently, the combination of dopamine release in the brain plus a conditioned response with motor movement, the swipe with finger or thumb, makes this dopamine loop hard to stop. One way you can get some control is to create a counter movement, a physical movement you do that becomes its own conditioned response. For example, my counter movement conditioned response is that when I realize I'm in a dopamine loop, I immediately press the home button and place the phone face side down. And of course, similar loops of compulsion occur in other kinds of online and offline behavior, such as gaming, playing games, or gambling, which can become addictive. So the question for us today is what we can practically do to try to escape these kinds of addictive loops. And I think Susan Weinschenk's approach of this counter movement is pretty much exactly a practice of sense restraint, of noticing the problem, quitting the program, and putting the phone down. This requires us, of course, to be mindfully aware of when these kind of loops start to propagate, when they become problematic. So guarding the sense doors in this sense becomes a practice of mindful media hygiene. We notice when things become problematic and restrain the senses around those. We create intentional boundaries around our sense input. For example, we can put our phone down during meals. We can unsubscribe from sensationalist or triggering accounts. We can work to limit the time we spend doom scrolling. Perhaps we can even put our phone into grayscale mode or turn off the sound in order to limit our reactivity. We can practice mindfulness of reactivity. Notice when we're stuck in these kinds of dopamine loops. Notice when our mind starts spinning out on the features and details of what surrounds us, particularly in our media landscape. And then practice stepping back a bit. We can also practice a kind of an internal strengthening, a strengthening of our own internal abilities to counter-react by forming other kinds of relationships, by practicing things like kindness and compassion, generosity towards others, helping others. Practice in-world relationships rather than making our lives more and more exclusively online. So clearly you do not need to live in a cave or be a monastic in order to practice sense restraint. We can start today simply by reflecting on how we feed our mind and whether we're feeding it things that are really good for it and healthy or not. So this practice of guarding the sense doors isn't so much about avoidance as it is about keeping our minds uncluttered, about wise attention to what pulls us into these reactive loops and that become eventually detrimental to our health, and learning to soften around them or give them up. It's about renouncing what's unhealthy for us in order for ourselves to live more freely. It's about protecting our inner silence to allow joy and peace and wisdom to arise. In a noisy world that's tailored to grab and keep our attention, this kind of practice may be the most radical of all. So let me know, have you practiced guarding your sense doors, and how has it helped your practice and your life today? Let us know. And if you want to hear more about this gradual training that I mentioned a couple of times in this video, I have a whole video about that, which I'll leave up here on the screen so you can hear more. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.